2023 promises to be another momentous year for advanced air mobility, with news coming from the many companies vying to be first to market with new eVTOL aircraft. And to help me make sense of all of that, we're going to be talking to a seasoned expert, Sergio Cecutta from SMG, and we'll be grilling him on the very brave predictions he's made for the coming year. So today I'm joined by a very special guest, a gentleman who I consider a friend and a respected colleague who has followed this advanced air mobility sector at least as long as I have. Sergio Cecutta from SMG Consulting. Very good to have you here. Now, I should say Sergio is a much braver man than I am. He makes it his business every year to make some predictions for how things are going to work out in advanced air mobility. I don't know whether he uses a crystal ball or some sophisticated Californian software, but he does annual predictions. And before we get into what you're saying you think will happen in 2023, Sergio, how did 2022 work out? Was it as expected? And how were your predictions last year?
2022 was a year where I think a lot of companies needed to execute, and that's exactly what a lot of the companies have done. I think we've seen a lot of news about, progress of their testing. One thing that you haven't seen a lot of new companies come up. I think we are getting to the point in the industry where we have the entrance that we have, and it's also getting more difficult to raise capital for completely new ventures. As far as our predictions, it is good to put yourself out there. And I think it was 50-50. We gave ourselves, I think, a B-. Really, there was always factors from the outside that impact some of the prediction. Like, for example, in case of the EHang aircraft that we had predicted would certify before the end of the year, all the COVID restriction and lockdowns really impacted that. And as well as I think one of the learnings for the year and something that we already knew, hardware is hard. And it's really showing because it's not easy to develop this aircraft.
Yeah, those are great points. So now let's talk about what you see happening this year. And I noticed that the first of your 5 predictions is that Archer, Beta Technologies, Joby and Volocopter, who have emerged, I think it's fair to say, as sort of front runners in this sector, you say they'll roll out conforming aircraft this year. But first, let's explain what you mean by a conforming aircraft.
The conforming aircraft is a black and white gate. It is either a 1 or is a 0. An airplane is either conforming or it is not conforming. And what is a conforming aircraft? A conforming aircraft is basically an airplane that has been produced on a line that is either already certified by the regulator or will be certified by the regulator in conjunction with the type certificate. And it is basically the airplane that will go through flight test in order to receive the type certificate. Therefore, imagine it as the master after which all of the other airplanes will be copies of, perfect copies of. And so to us, that's very important because in order to begin flight test for credit with the FAA, you need to have a conforming aircraft. And it's important to have these two pieces, the production line as well as the aircraft itself to make it a conforming aircraft. And really, if you look, an ideal flight test takes between 12 and 18 months. In my over 25 years in aerospace, I've never seen a perfect flight test, even from storied companies with hundreds of years of experience. So if you just take those 18 months and you add them to 2023, you really get to the end of 24. And that's why we're saying if we don't see a conforming aircraft this year, it is highly unlikely that a 24 or 25 certification and entry into service is possible.
We talked about EHang earlier, and they're the subject of your second prediction. Now, I've engaged with EHang to some degree over this past year. They've been hinting for some time that they think they're really close to getting type certification approved in their home country, China. Now, given what we know about the Western competitors and their timeline, if that's true, then it kind of seems like maybe the Chinese process is a year or more ahead of other countries. How is that really possible? And does that tell us something about the Chinese certification process?
So I think it's a little bit difficult to draw a perfect comparison between Western regulators and China. And the reason, and again, when we talk about Western regulators, we're talking about the two leading regulators being EASA and the FAA. The difference here is that CAAC, that is the Chinese regulator, has put emphasis and allowed what they call the certification of passenger carrying drones. Therefore, you are going to be allowed to carry passenger without a pilot on board. In the West, we look at that as autonomy, and it is something that is in the roadmaps that you see out there, an item that will appear as a path to certification sometimes in the next decade. So really, I don't think we can say they're more advanced or the regulators of the West are more conservative. It's just a completely different approach. And the EHang aircraft is we think it's a very Chinese market aircraft. But at the same time, we do not have to forget that China is one of the largest markets in the world. And so the aircraft can be extremely successful at home, and it can give EHang the means to then build other vehicles for other parts of the world. And again, they had announced their VT-30, that is their Lift Plus Cruise longer range aircraft. So they're already thinking about in terms of a family of aircrafts. And we see these aircraft being certified sometimes in the first half of the year. Once again, now that the China is opened completely when it comes to COVID, it's another variable that has been introduced, and we need to see again how that plays with the industrial progress.
Now, in your third prediction, you're focusing on the financial environment, and you're basically saying that it's going to be harder for companies to get the capital they need. Why do you think there's this sort of drying up of capital? Was there ever going to be enough money to go around for all these companies? And is this going to sort of slow down the path to market for these eVTOL aircraft in particular?
Let's look at it in a few different ways, right? The cost of capital has significantly increased. We've had many times the central bank raise the interest rate, so the cost of debt has gone up, and also the cost of equity has gone up. So whether you either get money from a lender or you raise capital from investors, it's become more complicated. And actually, one sentence that really hit home with me, talking to some bankers from Wall Street, was one of the bankers said, "It is a horrible time to raise capital." This was the exact word, and I wanted to write them down. And really, it's beginning to be very complex to raise cash. And if you look at the funding from last year, so in 2021, we, I think, looked at about a little over $3 billion coming into the industry. Last year was 1.9 billion. So it was already a significant reduction. And again, the industry that we follow, there is always a long tail that is attached with these industries. When you look at this 1.9 billion, a little over 1.1 went to 3 OEMs. So what you're seeing is that money is concentrating in the hands of what you can call the most promising players. But again, what we've seen lately, we've seen companies raising capital at valuations significantly lower than before, almost 1/10 the valuation of the specs, as well as it's getting just more difficult to convince investors to put money. Why? Because really, money a few years ago was free, so it needed to find a place to be. Now there is other uses for this cash rather than just going to these startups.
And is that maybe why, lately we've seen some announcements where companies seem to be looking for new sources of additional capital or credit, if you like, to keep things moving. So, for example, Archer announced a partnership with Stellantis, the car maker, and part of that was that Stellantis will release about $150 million in extra capital as needed. And then we saw Eve, which is the Brazilian company that's ultimately owned by Embraer, announcing that it's going to get some money from the Brazilian National Bank of Development. So I guess that's evidence of companies having to go to different places to find pots of money.
When you look at the money, there is many different color of money, right? I mean, and the best color of money for any one of these companies is strategic. And what we mean with a strategic investors is an investor that it's not investing just because they see a good opportunity, but they're really investing because they see this company as part of their overall strategy. And if you look at Carlos Tavares, that is the CEO of Stellantis, when he was talking about Archer, he was talking about Archer as an additional piece of their portfolio of mobility. So they said, we don't make cars anymore. We provide freedom of mobility for people. And one of these venues of freedom of mobility is eVTOL. And also the other part that you see some company needed to raise money because they need to, and some other companies that are looking at additional funds of cash just in case. You've seen Joby file a shelf offer for $1 billion. And a shelf offer is basically notifying the regulator that at some point in the future, they might want to raise additional cash. But that doesn't mean at some point in the future, it means just that. Sometimes. We don't know when. And so it's just being prepared. And I think it's similar to what Archer has done with Stellantis. But again, that deal, I think, has a significance for the production side more than funding.
Now, in your fourth prediction, you again talk about some new aircraft that we might see this year. But this time you're talking about demonstrator aircraft, not conforming aircraft. I think you said that the first flights could be delayed, not that they could happen. And if they're going to be delayed, why do you think that is? And why does it matter?
So if you look at the development of these aircraft, right, the way that we see it is made of many different stages. And you start basically from component testing on the ground all the way to a conforming aircraft having opened the entire envelope. And in between, there is many pieces. And one of these pieces is flying a full-scale prototype and or demonstrator. And the idea of this full-scale demonstrator is to basically prove all the components coming together, as well as proving the aerodynamics. Many times we hear the word transition. Most of these vehicles have wings. And the idea of having a wing is something that Elevate introduced a long time ago. And it's the fact that a wing is the most efficient way to keep something in the air. And so the whole idea is that between this vertical part of the flight and this cruise part of the flight, there is a transition from lift on rotors to lift on wing. And that is an extremely important piece of the aerodynamic of any of these vehicles. And so this demonstrator, especially the full size, are very important for this. What you will see is a lot of the companies, a lot of these top companies, as you have seen, they already have demonstrator flying. And for many of them, demonstrator have already transitioned. However, these other, let's call it second tier of companies that are nipping at the heels of the big guys, they are expecting to fly this demonstrator. However, as we have seen this year as well, it is not easy to put these aircraft together. And also when it comes to flying, it's one of these, it depends again. Is it a tethered flight? Is it a non-tethered flight? Is the battery on board? Is the battery on the ground? So there is still a lot of flavors, but we think that it is not easy to do this. And so we expect that a lot of the companies coming out with these demonstrators will actually take a little more time. And when you mention companies, people that are expecting to come up with demonstrator, they rank from, the big OEMs like Airbus or Aviation, Textron, all the way to some of the smaller companies like Electra that are basically rolling out these demonstrators. And we think it's going to be a little more difficult to just get all of these in a row. I don't think we're ready to say how many of these are going to be delayed, but I think it's a good prediction.
It's something to watch out for this year. And could that also include maybe people like Vertical Aerospace and Lilium, who, I know Lilium has technology demonstrators, but not a sort of full-scale one that represents what it's going to do. Is this also a critical year for those companies?
Yes, I mean, both Vertical and Lilium, I think they are continuing to expand their envelope. And I think that while the Lilium demonstrator is not full scale, it's large enough that I think the aerodynamic, it's good aerodynamic learning there. And again, the folks at Vertical are just starting the expansion of the envelope for their vehicle. When we talk about this demonstrator, we're talking about demonstrator that you haven't seen yet. Right. There is a lot more that are coming this year. And again, if you want to fly and certify in 26, 27, this is also the year where you want some of this demonstrator to start accruing some of the hours.
And your fifth and final prediction is that we're going to see a big increase in the number of vertiport companies. So what do you expect these companies are going to be doing during 2023? Are we going to see more than just artists' impressions of these facilities for eVTOL aircraft? Might we even see some early construction work happening, or some serious planning at least?
So when it comes to vertiport, I think it's there is a little bit of a difference because when you talk about an OEM, is a very defined perimeter around the world. You know exactly what an OEM is. When it comes to a vertiport company, the perimeter is not as clearly defined. There is a lot of pieces that go into a vertiport that enters operation. And one of the reasons that we chose vertiport as a proxy for infrastructure, because really, once a vertiport is open, it means all of the other pieces are in place. You have your airspace, you have your charging, you have your multimodal, you have your ATC, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to vertiports, really, the OEMs are really selling mostly worldwide products. But when it comes to vertiport, really, there is opportunities in each country for different companies to be looking at these vertiports. And the other part is also, what do we mean with vertiport? And what do we mean with vertiport? Some companies, for example, are companies that they want to build the vertiport, they want to operate the vertiport. There is other companies that they just want to operate the vertiport, other companies that are just involved into getting the vertiport started and someone else is going to operate it. And so what we've seen is once we started looking at the infrastructure, it was a little bit like looking at the surface of the ocean. And as soon as we poked our head under the waves, there was so much more. And any day there is new companies that we are discovering, and new companies, again, that not PowerPoint companies. These are companies that are doing a lot of work. And that is why we see the number double. For sure, in our air index that covers the infrastructure, you will see the number of companies that we follow doubling. And then the last piece for your question about, is it important to have prototypes? I think, once again, we really need to understand the process because, once again, the vertiport cannot be an airport, but a vertiport cannot be a subway or a bus stop. So it's something in between. And it's this in between that we need to actually, in reality, try to understand better.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, these are excellent discussion points. These brave predictions of yours. I think in general, some of the features of these predictions to me speak to perhaps a year of truth in this industry, where we're going to find out even more conclusively, who are going to be the leaders here, who are going to be the successful ones. I know that when we both started to look at this sector, I mean, there were literally hundreds of companies coming into it. There still are in a way. But do you think this might be the year where we really see the cream kind of rising to the top and a lot of the other players, if not completely disappearing, then perhaps becoming less relevant and less important for us to follow?
This emphasis we're putting on conforming aircraft is really a gate through which, if you do not go through, you are not certifying an airplane. If you don't certify an airplane, you are not going to go into service. Therefore, you're not going to make any money. And investors only have that much patience in financing a company with no revenue. So I think it is important this year because we are going to start to see company having to go through specific milestone. It's beginning to be one of those conditions without which you will not be successful. But at the same time, again, we need to also distinguish between these followers that are following because they weren't able to keep up and the followers that are following because they had no intention of keeping up. And so there is companies like, for example, to just cite one, Supernal or Aviation, they say, no, we don't want to be there at the very beginning. Let these folks work with the regulator. Let these folks understand the regulations, create the regulations, work through the regulations, certify. Let these folks start service, and then we will come in once all of this is understood. So it's these companies that have not been able to follow, but they really want to be up there at the very beginning. And I think then now it's, I always call it the problem of the mountains, right? When you're climbing a mountain, you think it's really the tallest mountain until you get to the top and then you see that there is a taller one behind you. And I think the mountain of certification is what we're climbing. I think the next mountain is going to be production. And then ultimately, the ultimate mountain is going to be making money, being a profitable company. But I think that is a few years in the future, not something we should worry about this year.
Good point. But of course, there's plenty enough this year, I'm sure, to keep you and your colleagues at SMG busy. And Sergio, I should point out, you're based in Southern California, or I guess if not in Los Angeles, then pretty close to it. Los Angeles is one of the predicted early adopters for eVTOL air taxi services, potentially in 2025. I don't want to rush your 2025 predictions, but personally, as an individual, do you think it's likely that you could be flying on an eVTOL air taxi service somewhere in Southern California or in 2025? Is that something you're personally looking forward to?
So let me start with the end. Yes, I personally looking forward to this. If you look at the US is what we call these metro areas that are basically a conglomeration of a significant amount of cities. What we call LA Metro, that is not Los Angeles, is Los Angeles and all the other cities, is composed of a little over 133 cities. It is 4 times the size of London, and it has a population of 25 million people. And these 25 million people like to drive in their car by themselves. So it's the only place where you will see 7 or 8 lanes of traffic completely blocked. So we're kind of used. When you see a lot of car, people say, oh, there's traffic. No, you haven't seen it yet. And so all of us dream of being able to fly on top of this traffic. And also the fact that at that point, we might even be able to choose what airport to fly from. The LA area has 5 airports with commercial service. The other point, I think, is there's 2 more points. Number one, what do we define by start of service? So a lot of folks, they think, oh my God, in 2025, we're not going to have the skies blackened by these vehicles. This vehicle won't blacken the skies for decades. It's going to take times to get there. But at the same time, some service with some specific flights per day, I think it's something that's going to be feasible in 2025. And last but not least, we don't have to forget that both sides of the ocean now have dates to anchor their services to. On the European side of the ocean, there is the 2024 Olympics in Paris, where a lot of the OEMs now have a goal. Let's transport passengers in 2024. And the US is moving towards, and you've heard the administrator of the FAA talk about this 2028 date, where once again, it's going to be the Olympic in Los Angeles in 2028. And so both sides of the oceans now have specific milestones to go after. But I think it's highly likely that you will be able to take one of these vehicles in 2025. Again, just don't expect to pay the same price as an Uber X.
Excellent. Well, we'll be optimistic as you are, but we do thank you, Sergio, for your very sober advice as to what we can expect from this year. And we'll go on this journey with you throughout 2023 and see how that unfolds. So thank you so much, Sergio.
Thank you so much for having us.